Hello class, welcome to the September 23rd tutorial on combining shapes. It's useful to know how to combine shapes because that way we can use the basic geometric forms to build them up into more complex forms, essentially enabling us to draw any objects. Today's tutorial will cover drawing these two forms, a Tetris piece and sort of this Arc de Triomphe from France. We'll look at two different ways to attempt the Tetris piece, one way with subtraction, one way with addition, and then move on to this arc over here on the right. The homework is to follow along and just have one page of each of these, so when it comes to the Tetris piece, you can pick which method makes most sense to you. Wouldn't hurt to attempt both, but the homework is just to have one page of each of these objects. Starting with the Tetris piece, start in a familiar way. We're going to start with a bounding box. So I'm going to start with my leading edge towards the left side of the paper. Nice long line. I'm going to find the top and bottom of where this starts. Again, we want a fairly large object. The goal is to have an object that's roughly 1 wide by 3 long. So I'm going to go ahead and start to put in my converging lines. I'm using an imaginary vanishing point, but if you want to use the 11 by 17, that is quite all right. It's whatever your comfort level is. If you are going with imaginary vanishing points, just make sure the lines are converging with each other. So now I'm going to define my shorter edge here. And if this is like a value of 1, I want it to go about 3, a value of 1 here. I want to make sure it goes about 3 this way, so maybe somewhere about here would be where I would define the other edge of my objects. I am using the 10% marker, again as a sort of a light underlay. Now we're going to get the tops. When I draw this line, I'm looking at this line next to it, making sure that they're converging. I would say this next line is probably the hardest one. It's converging with these ones that are kind of far away. We're also trying to make sure that this doesn't look too much longer than that. And we can always make adjustments. You know, this happens when you are drawing with an imaginary vanishing point. You kind of tweak your lines a bit. It is helpful to have this back edge here. So I'm going to take this line back to the right. This one's a little bit easier because I have this nice long line to look at as I go. And now I can use this edge coming down vertically in the back to kind of give me a connect the dots here to kind of check my work of going back to this vanishing point. So now just take stock of your bounding box. This is probably one of the most important parts of your drawing. Sometimes I'll go over several times, like just slightly adjusting the lines, maybe bringing this one in a bit, you know, making sure that this shape looks a little bit bigger than this one. So these are some tweaks that go on, especially when you're using an imaginary vanishing point. All right, I feel like that's a pretty good start. So once again, this is our bounding box. So now I'm going to find the center of this face, which also all of this should be familiar. So using an X, and you know, if we recall the Tetris piece, it has sort of like 3 cubes on the bottom and 1 cube on top. But this first method, we're going to use subtraction. So the goal of combining shapes is now we have this large rectangular piece. I'm going to draw 2 smaller prisms here, rectangular prisms, cube-like. And when we ink in the final shape, we'll trace out the negative of those shapes. And again, hopefully that will be clear as we continue on. So I have the center. My goal is to divide this into thirds. As we know, it's easier to divide into quarters and halves, but we can use center and quarters and halves to kind of guide us. So for example, I can now divide this into quarters by finding an X of the half, the center of the half. And now we know that, like, if this is a quarter of our shape, the third should be somewhere in the middle here. So again, I'm just going to kind of draw a line here. This represents 1/3 of the object. I'll find the half on this right side too, or sorry, the quarter. And again, we know the third is like somewhere in between these two. So bring that up, and again, final judgment by eye. So here's the center. I'm going to divide this object in half again. So this line is going back to our right vanishing point. I'm looking at the lines above and below it to make sure it's converging. And now is when I make some final tweaks by eye to what I judge to be 1/3. So I'm just like looking at these lines and scooching them over a bit, just trying to make sure that like this width and this width look roughly equal. Really, it's going to get smaller here on this side. So again, we started with a bounding box, and then we just kind of carved this face up. So that was the first step. So now we're going to get into the combining of shapes. I'll switch color, hopefully, to make it more clear. So if this is our starting rectangular shape, I'm now going to draw a smaller shape in here. It's going to represent a cube, but it's not going to be perfect, so I'm going to call it another rectangle. So you can think of it starting the exact same way. We start with our leading edge here. Now we have our bottom and top defined because I found the middle. Again, kind of loosely representing this Tetris piece. We have our lines going back to our vanishing point, so this helps us. So the base of this line is going back this way. The top of the line is going along this top edge. And in fact, I know where this stops here because I have this line. But I don't know what this looks like on this back left side. So I'm going to take these 2 points and go back to my left vanishing point. Again, spinning the paper because that is my comfort level in drawing straight lines, is a 45-degree angle, so don't forget to do that. The top edge is aligned here. And now where this bottom edge intersects this back line, this is the back of my yellow rectangle. This top edge aligns. Here's a new edge going back from here to the left again. And looking at the lines around it to make sure they're all kind of converging equally. If I'm being a little judgmental, it's probably a little too close to here, so maybe just like open it up a bit, maybe mark that new back corner. Now this intersection point is going to go off to the right, and then bringing this line down vertically just kind of to check the work. And again, here's another new edge. If this is the right edge of my cube, this coming back, connecting the dots, just checking all of these yellow lines against the gray to make sure that they're converging about the same. So now I have a yellow object drawn inside of a gray object. We'll repeat this process on the right side here, again to kind of subtract from our larger shape, removing the 2 colored shapes to get our Tetris piece. So now to just repeat that process, I'm going to split the difference here. I'm just judging by eye. Again, if you recall that quote by, I believe it's Spencer Nugent, learning to draw is learning to see. I'm just judging by eye to make sure these look all roughly equal, knowing that this should be smaller than this one, again, as a rough rule of thumb in perspective. So I'm just repeating this process with the yellow square. So we start with this blue leading edge. I already defined where it stops because I had it from the gray square, but if this is our leading edge, we're going to send the baseline back to the right. This line back to the left, I'm looking at the lines near it, so I'm looking at mainly this yellow line. And making sure, it's kind of close to parallel, maybe it's a little, again, making sure it converges a little bit more. Looking at this top line, maybe it's a little bit converging too much with this one. So I can kind of just like make some tweaks, open it up a bit. Same here on the top, we have the one going to the right because we have this gray line helping us. And then this one here back over to the left. Now I have this gray line and this yellow line to look at. So kind of splitting the difference between those two. Now where it intersects back here, I know this is where it comes down. Again, always helpful to draw the back. I think this was some of the challenges with the letter forms, is if you don't draw the kind of hidden side, it can lead to more confusion. So again, I'm kind of tweaking this line, just like looking at what's around it. And let's see, so we've now defined our edges, and now it's just finishing the top, but we can already see our gray lines kind of complete our square for us. So we can just go over that in blue, just to highlight what's going on. And again, now we can get this back edge. I can have a vertical line back here. Where these intersect, I can go back to the right. It should be the same line as this yellow one. And same here, now it's a bit of a connect the dots, but this is a way to check the work. Does that blue line look like it's converging with the others? And I think so, it's close enough. It's not perfect, but it's close enough. So now again, we have a gray object that we started with. We drew two smaller rectangular objects, roughly representing cubes, a yellow one and a blue one on either side, after dividing the front face, of course. And so now this is a way to combine shapes with subtraction. Again, it's starting with a large shape, drawing two smaller shapes, and the smaller shapes actually represent material being removed from the larger shape. And when I ink this in, hopefully that might make it a little bit more clear. So again, it may help to have this interim step of like maybe going over with pencil lightly just to see what it is that we want. So keeping the Tetris piece in mind, I know we are going to have this base. These are going to come up here. But remember, we want to subtract the blue and the yellow. So if the yellow is no longer here, that means we're going to see this top face right here. And this is now going to be an outside edge. This back line here will now be an inside edge. So the key to subtracting shapes is just making sure you draw in the correct lines. So in this instance, it was critical that we had this back sort of unseen edges of the yellow shape. Now we see them again because the yellow shape is being removed from the gray shape. So I continue to ink in. And essentially all that we care about the yellow shape are this bottom face and this right face of it. Again, being subtracted from the gray. With the blue, it's similar. So we have this edge, again, holding the Tetris piece in my mind's eye. We want this edge here. The blue is being removed. So we also then would see this back edge here. And now simply to complete our shape, we have the top that we ink in as we go. And there you have it. We started with a gray shape, drew the yellow and the blue cube, and then the key was when we come in and ink it in or add darker lines, we treat the yellow and the blue as if they're being removed from the gray. So again, it's as if this material is no longer here, therefore we trace sort of these hidden edges in the back that we see. To finish this off, I would go over with ink and with a Sharpie, or you could stay with the pencil and just make sure you hit, slightly heavier lines on the bottom here. Maybe this back edge too, maybe this edge to kind of push this face back away from us. So that is the Tetris piece with subtraction. We can, of course, also do a Tetris piece with addition, where we add shapes onto it. So because we already did this hard work, we could use this as an underlay, or if you are starting fresh and would prefer to do the addition method as opposed to the subtraction method, you can start with a shorter leading edge here on the left. And the goal this time is to actually just start with a cube. So bottom left of the page, we'll start with a small leading edge, send our imaginary vanishing point off to the right. Again, I'm using my first piece as an underlay, but if you're starting fresh, just do your best to draw a cube in the bottom left quadrant of your page. So I'm going to define where the edges are. Again, I'm kind of cheating because I'm using my underlay. If you're using the imaginary vanishing point, just make sure that these are converging slightly, coming together. Back line going off to the right, looking at this line going off to the left, looking at this one. And just kind of judging, does this look a bit longer than this? Maybe it looks like this line needs to just come down a bit. Somewhere there. Kind of judging my cube. It's looking a little long, but it's okay. We're just trying to get it close. And for now, I'm not going to draw the backs of this. Again, it's generally best practice too, so maybe I should, but the reason I'm holding off on that for now is we want to duplicate the shape. And again, this is like that same method that we learned the Wednesday before Project 1 was due. So we would find the center here. This is where it's helpful to have these lines nice and long. We would find the center of this face. We then extend the middle here, again looking at either lines on either side to kind of split that difference. And now here was the key step, is going from an opposite corner through the middle here with a straight line, and it's going to bisect either of these two lines. It doesn't matter where you start, whether you start in the bottom or the top. In this instance, I'm starting at the top to go to the bottom edge. And now where that goes, this is another cube, and I can continue that process through here and here to get 3 of them. And to now have a shape that's roughly 1 wide by 3 long. I mean, already this is a method of addition. We started with 1, and we're now adding 2 more to get it to be 3 long. So that, again, is where this width duplication technique, we're duplicating how wide this is 3 times. That's where this technique comes in handy. So now I will complete my shape. That's kind of this like shorter rectangle. Now is when I'm going to draw this back edge. Like I said, it can be handy. Actually, by my eye, it looks like it's going to kind of align with the center edge. So apologies if that's a bit confusing. That was just by pure chance. This back corner is going to go off to the left. So again, I'm looking at the lines around here, sending that back off this way, completing this line, kind of looking at these 2 lengths, taking this intersection point and running it down. And now I can run this back this way. It's a little confusing. It looks like it aligns with the yellow. Again, all pure chance. The reminder that the yellow lines are just connections from a corner through the center to just duplicate how wide the shape is 3 times. But anyway, so I'm connecting the dots from here to here. So this gray line is actually a convergence line. It's looking at all the lines around it. It just happens to closely align with the yellow. So now I have, or we have, a shorter, kind of like stick of butter, kind of proportioned object. And if you recall, whereas we started with like a nice tall object here and we subtracted these 2 shapes, we now have a shorter object here, and we want to add, in this instance, we're just going to add 1 cube on top, again, to have the same end goal of reaching that Tetris piece. So I'm going to switch to blue here, and now I have, going over the gray line and this yellow edge, I'm going to just draw a square on this face, and the goal is to use the same duplication technique to draw this cube above. So once again, I find the center. So now, whereas before we had this center line and we were duplicating from left to right, we are now duplicating from bottom to top. So this is where it's helpful to have either edge in the direction we want to go extended. Same with this center line. Really, the goal was to find that point here. And now again, we can take either of these opposite corners and draw a straight line through here, and wherever it bisects the edge is where we will duplicate the height of this cube twice. So in this instance, I will pick this right edge. That way our line will bisect here and we can go off to the right vanishing point, and that way we will hit both lines, or both of these extended edges with 1 line. So I'm starting from this right edge through the middle, running this up through the top, and then taking this point and going off to the right vanishing point, looking at these lines around it. Maybe it's a little too high, just bring that down a bit. Again, judging by eye is always critical as we move along and add things. So now this essentially becomes my new leading edge of my new shape. I have the top line going here, the bottom line is given to me, it's this gray line. This one here running back, it happens to align with the edge of this first cube. So again, I can kind of look at this gray line, and because they're basically touching, those can basically be parallel. Here is a new shape, so this one, or a new line rather, so I'm looking at the lines around it to make sure it's converging slightly. I have my back edge defined. It's where this blue line hits the back of the gray. Bring that up. Where these intersect, I now can bring a line off to the right. And now where this vertical line intersects this one, I can bring a line back to the left. Same here, this corner back to the left, looking at these 2 lines on either side of it. And now I can kind of check my work. Do these align vertically? Yeah, that's pretty close. So in this instance, we're adding the blue to the gray. So now, once again, when I come to my inking in step, or if you want to do an interim step of like light pencil, Once again, if I know roughly the object I'm drawing, what I want it to look like in my head, I'm imagining the Tetris piece. So I'll hit the base and the sides. And now before, where we were drawing sort of the negative of the yellow, so this back edge that we wouldn't see, we're now drawing the positive of the blue. And again, there's two different methods to the same end result. One is a subtraction. The first is subtraction. The second one that we're doing now is addition. One method may make more sense than another. It's good to be aware of both because depending on the situation, one may be easier than the other. So in this instance, again, we're inking in the positive of the cube as if it's added on top of the gray stick of butter. So now I'm going over the blue lines that we would see, and I'm ignoring the blue lines that we wouldn't see that are obscured by the shape of the object. Trying to watch my perspective as I add this light pencil to make sure that, you know, all the lines are still converging, it still looks good. So there is a method of addition. So once again, we started with, in this instance, we started with one cube because we wanted to have a roughly accurate 3 by 2 tall. We used the cube duplication technique to grow it to what I was calling a stick of butter. So we kind of started with this shorter rectangle. We then drew a blue cube on top, again using this duplication method to kind of keep the proportion accurate. This of course could be completely judged by eye. You could start by just drawing a stick of butter, finding the center, and then drawing a cube on top. And once again, when you ink it in, you are inking in the combination of the stick of butter with the cube sitting on top of it. And really, that's the basics of combining shapes. It's just the knowledge that you can use the basic geometries stacked together to add, or within each other to subtract. And again, it totally depends on what your goals are in the object that you're drawing. In this instance, you know, showing two different methods to the same end result for the Tetris piece. So the next one we'll draw is going to be this, again, Arc de Triomphe, where we kind of start with, once again, a larger bounding box. We're going to introduce one of the new geometries that we learned on Wednesday, previous class, where we'll draw this cylinder lying down, or it's like a steamroller wheel going through the middle, removed from the shape. This is an instance where you have to use subtraction. Because this is like an opening, it's like a window through the shape, there is no way to kind of do this with addition. So, once again, I will start with my 10% and leading edge. So, and also off to the left of the page, similar to how we started the first tutorial. And nice and big, define where our object starts and stops, send our converging lines off to the right, making sure that they're slightly coming together, converging lines off to the left, also that they're slightly coming together. This is another instance where we want to go about 1 wide by 3 long. So making this shape a little bit more narrow, defining where that edge is. So here, if I see like how deep is this, and I go 1, 2, 3, maybe it ends roughly there. And now we can hit our top edges. Once again, the top face is always the trickiest. Will continue to be tricky throughout your career. I always struggle with it. Again, moving the horizon line up can make your life a little bit easier if you particularly struggle with that. But now, of course, this is definitely an instance where we want to see these back lines. You can also think of this as like, you can see this line kind of went a bit converging too quickly. And I know that because if I look at the top line, it almost looks like they're diverging. They're going away from each other. So that's why I drew the second line back here, moving it up a bit. And now I can take this back edge, looking at the lines around it, making sure it's kind of converging. It's actually kind of in between these two. And now where this intersects and this intersects, this should have a vertical relationship. And that looks pretty close. If you ever get like too fussy with the bounding box and it gets messy, it never hurts to, you can always like have a page to set up the bounding box and then take a fresh one over it to have it nice and clean. Like if you have too many lines like this and it makes your drawing confusing, not a bad thing to do. All right, so here we have our bounding box, our starting shape of our object. Now, of course, the goal is to put sort of an arc in the middle. Another way to think about this is to think of it as like a letter form, kind of like a letter N, maybe like a lowercase n. So I'm going to start by finding the center of this face. Once again, with that X. This time I'm going to just kind of judge by eye what 1/3 is. And it's not, again, it's not quite as critical. So if I kind of draw a line here, just a little bit left of center, where this intersects the X, if I draw a line off to my right vanishing point, where this line intersects here and bring this down, it kind of happens to align with the back edge. Again, sorry if that's a bit confusing, that's unintentional. I now know that I have this centered on the object. So that's another kind of geometry trick of using this line vertically, where it hits the X. If I draw a line off to my right vanishing point, where it hits the next part of the X, if I bring that down, I know I have this shape centered on this wider shape. And now we have kind of the start of our arc. If I keep it simple for a minute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to yellow, and we're going to draw on this back face here. We're going to do the exact same thing we just did on the front face. And I think this is maybe a step that could have made the letter forms less confusing, is whatever letter you draw on the front, so for example, if you drew an X on here, if you drew the same X on the back in the exact same process and then connected the dots, that should make your life a bit easier. So we'll try that method with this arc. So I'll just go over this in yellow so that we can see what I'm talking about. For now, we can ignore the front gray. We're just looking at this back square, and I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did on the front. So I'm going to find the center of the back face with an X. Now, I did pick this line arbitrarily, so it would be an arbitrary pick here, but I do want them to relate. So just for this one step, I'm going to take this bottom point here, send this back to the left vanishing point, and where this intersects here, this is where I'm going to start my vertical line. And again, it's just to have this front face align with the back face. So I bring this vertical line, once again where it hits here, I'm going to go off to the right vanishing point, looking at the lines around it to make sure it's converging. Where it intersects this other side of the X, I'm just going to run this down. And now if we were drawing like kind of a letter form N, if I connected this base, we essentially have this very blocky N with this back in here, a more simple letter form. But of course, we're going for something a little bit more complex. We're going to put a cylinder in the center here. And again, we are subtracting this shape. You can see, if you look at the back of this yellow and the front of this gray, it's almost as if we're drawing a rectangle within a larger rectangle, and we are going to be removing this material. So once again, when we ink in the shape, we want to ink in the back edges of this rectangle because it's being removed from the main bounding box. All right. So again, this is the simple form. What we want to do is create a cylinder within here. So I'm going to now just look at this front face. Again, switching to blue, hopefully for a little bit more clarity as we get all these lines. And I'm defining the bottom of this shape here, once again using the X, where this intersects here. I'm throwing this blue line off to the right vanishing point. And now we have this square face in the middle here. We're going to use this square face to draw an ellipse on it, just like we learned on the previous class, So once again, we learned two methods. I'm going to use the longer form method in this instance. So I already have center here, but I'll go over it again in blue just so we can see it to get this X. Now once we have center, we want to draw a line off to the right vanishing point, looking at either lines above and below, kind of splitting that difference, vertical line through the center. And once again, this method is a little bit longer form, so we're going to then connect all of these center points on this square face. And if you recall, with this X, we find roughly about halfway. Again, this is just a rough guide. So again, between this edge and this corner, roughly halfway, that's what those dots represent. And these are our first round of dots, and now we're just connecting all of these into an ellipse. So I'm going to start nice and light, kind of build this up into our ellipse there. I'll go ahead and do the same on the back, this time in orange. So again, looking at where this X stops here, send this off to the right. This is the square that we're looking at in here. We already have the center X in yellow, but I'll go over it again in orange. Once again, find our center vertically, center left to right, looking at the lines around it. Draw a diamond. Find these center points halfway between the edge of the diamond and the corner. And again, we already have these corners of the diamond. And once again, it's just connecting the dots to get our ellipse on there. And now we have the start of a steamroller wheel, or a cylinder lying down inside of our object. If we were to complete the steamroller wheel, we would, probably connect these two lines with a tangent relationship and down here on the bottom. But once again, we are subtracting this basic geometric shape from this larger one. So this all comes down to how we ink it in. And in fact, we're basically at that stage now. We have our larger bounding box that we started with. We drew this gray face in the center. We repeated the process on the back in yellow. We then used these faces to create this blue ellipse and this orange ellipse. And now, once again, this is maybe where it gets tricky because we have all these lines, but if you can hold in your mind's eye, or you imagine what it is you're trying to draw or achieve, when you ink it in, you kind of use this construction method to subtract the cylinder from the larger rectangular object. So I'll start with the easy edges that I know we're going to see. So we have, this two left edges, this bottom. Here's where maybe it gets a bit confusing. It might be tempting to go all the way across. But again, if you imagine like a lowercase n, it's going to stop here. We'll go along the top here in pencil. Get these edges. Back edge down. And now here's where it gets a little bit complicated because it is this kind of arc in the middle. So this line comes up. And again, this is why it's useful to be able to know to draw these basic geometries. We can now subtract this shape in here. So we have the top of our cylinder as it comes up and around and down, so kind of following that blue shape. And then our line comes down here like this. And now we can complete the base. We see this is where it's helpful to have drawn the back edge, because now we know that this line goes back to our vanishing point on the left. This would now run up. And here we don't see much of this based on how I set it up. It's probably going to be different for all of you, how much you see of this back edge. If you drew your shape a little bit deeper, you may not even see this orange shape at all. If you drew it more narrow or took like a lower horizon line, you might see more of this ellipse here. But we see our line come up and then it starts to turn and then disappears because it hits this edge here. If we do add a little bit of flourish to this actually before we do varied line weight. I don't know, looking at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, it has like some lines that slightly embezzle or make, add to the object. So I'm drawing a straight line here. These are basically parallel because they're close together. It's just like kind of like a little bit of the object bumping out beyond the shape. It really probably would be best practice to have done this in marker first. You don't have to do this. Again, I'm just kind of embellishing the object to make it look more like the landmark. It has this kind of like bump out here. This is a very simple technique you can do where you just kind of look at the line above it, just make the line go a little bit wide, stop it, and then just make sure you bring it back behind here. So we can do it again on this shape here. So maybe in the center of this arched curve, we can draw a line that's a little bit longer. Comes a bit wide, send this back behind the object, and these can go back to the left vanishing point. And then carry this on through here. Again, just going slightly beyond this edge here. Disappears back in. These go back to the left vanishing point. These lines are basically parallel to each other, and sending this back in. The pencil's kind of thick, but there would technically be like an interior edge here too. But there you have it. We have our sort of French landmark. If we wanted to go with heavier line weight, definitely hit the bases like this. And again, in this instance, I'd probably hit this right edge here to kind of push all this noise back behind it. We will eventually get into shading, but in this section, but anytime you kind of remove an interior object, interior shape, it would make sense to maybe shade this face. It's another way to kind of push that back and make it look like it's behind it. So this is how we use the basic geometries in combination with each other to create more complex forms. Once again, in this instance, using this cylinder lying down to remove this arced shape from the center of this rectangle. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, but I'm also will try and make time available in class on Wednesday to go over the homework and answer any questions that may have arisen. Thank you.